No. Hi. Hey everyone, how's it going? I am just stopping by to have a little chat. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Kayla, Daniel's girlfriend. So as many of you know, Daniel has recently taken some time away from the channel to focus 100% of his energy on his mental health, and I didn't want him worrying at all about the channel or stressing about the algorithm. So for the time being, I'm going to be hanging out here in front of the camera instead of behind it. And for those of you who tune in to watch the reading wrap-ups or fantasy news and are just finding that this is not the content you're looking for, don't worry, I totally get it. I appreciate you stopping by and I hope you have a beautiful day. Now, I promise I'm going to get to the meat of this video very soon, but before I do anything, I want to give a tremendous thank you to today's sponsor, Venti Coffee! It's finally happening. A coffee sponsorship. I have waited so long for this moment.
No matter how your day might be starting out, you can always get it back on track. Because with Venti Coffee, there's no such thing as a bad morning. Choose between their Coastal Roast, a medium dark blend with rich notes of brown sugar, hazelnut, and plum, or their Blue Ocean Roast, sourced exclusively from Colombia with a flavorful mix of Brazil nuts, grapefruit, and oak. A lot of coffee fans will talk about the mouthfeel, the texture, the body, and for casual drinkers, this might be a bit confusing. But to break down Venti Coffee, we found it to have a wonderfully balanced mouthfeel. Not too heavy, not too light. Now, texture will all depend on how you personally brew it, but our pour-over came out smooth and silky. The Coastal Roast in particular was a huge hit in our house.
And as a proud business owner myself, I love supporting small businesses that give back.
That's right. Venti Coffee donates 20% of their profits to support organizations that clean and protect our oceans. So you know that your contribution goes directly towards cleaning and safeguarding our marine environments, one delicious brew at a time. So if you're like Daniel and I and love coffee, check out Venti Coffee using the link below.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about reading in another language. I figured for my first video on the channel, I should speak about something that I'm really familiar with that Daniel probably isn't. And to be honest, during my quick perusing on YouTube and trying to find videos related to this, I couldn't really find anything. In fact, the only video I found that resonated with me was one done by another content creator in BookTube called Luminous Libro, so I'll link her down below. But her experience was as a native bilingual Spanish speaker, and she grew up for a period of time in Mexico and was surrounded by it. That was really different from my experience. So I found myself having a lot of overlap in some areas, but a little bit different in others, and I'm really curious to see what the Goblin Horde has to say on it. But especially for anyone who lives outside the traditional US educational system, I can already hear some of our European viewers being like, girl, I have about 3 to 4 to 5 languages in my head every single day. And to that I say, I am so deeply envious of you. I genuinely wish this was an aspect of my childhood that I would be able to change because it sounds so cool. So a quick note about my background. I'm sure you can probably tell I am a native English speaker. I did grow up here in the United States. And starting about 7th grade, I began studying Spanish in school up until my sophomore year of college, which is when I began my second major in Russian, which I finished while studying abroad in St. Petersburg. And it's been about a decade since I've used either of them, so those language muscles have completely atrophied. So that leaves me with the only language I really consider to be my second language, and that's Korean. And I'm sure there are some of you right now who are like, all right, Kayla, you talk a big game about speaking Korean, but like we haven't heard you speak any Korean, so I hear you. So I guess I'll do a little ditty now. 네, 안녕하세요. 2014년부터 2021년까지 한국에서 살았던 미국인 케일라 토레슨입니다. 반갑습니다. 네, 지금 미국에서 살고 있고 리치몬드에서 한국말 자주 못 쓰기 때문에 저의 한국말 실력이 좀 떨어지는 것 같아요. 아직도 너무 서툴고 부족해서 실수하더라도 이해해 주세요. Thank you. 한국에서 산 동안 한국어를 열공했고 말을 쓸수록 영어로 얘기하는 것보다 한국말로 얘기하는 거 더 편해졌어요. 뭐 일했을 때나 뭐 친구들 만났을 때나 뭐 배달 시켰을 때 모든 걸 한국어로 말했어요. 아, 그뿐만 아니라 우리 외국인 친구들도 한국어 굉장히 잘해서 영어는 우리 모국어라도 엄청 많이 썼어요. And I mean, yeah, there's been a lot of studies conducted on bilingual brains, and the results basically turn out that they're wired a little bit different. Now, I do want to add a disclaimer here. I am not an expert, but it did get me really curious about whether or not more studies will be conducted on native bilingual speakers who learn it as they grow up and in their environment versus people who perhaps learned it in a classroom setting. The long and short of this video basically comes down to me thinking about how do other people experience reading in another language. So, for example, the less that I used English, the faster that my Korean recall would be. And of course, while living abroad, this was super useful. I hadn't been using English for a while, so when I first moved back here, I found myself almost loading like a computer. But when it came to reading, I felt like I could settle into the language, and it was hard at first to describe this sensation until Luminous Libro called it the gear shift. And I think that's a really apt way and a great visual representation for what it feels like, just kind of clicking into one and clicking into another. But I actually like to think of it more like my brain is an office building. When I'm speaking or reading or writing in another language, I like to think of myself as going into an office, let's say the Korean office. And I sit myself at the desk, and on the wall there's books on history and culture, and there's filing cabinets with manila folders filled with vocabulary and grammar and structure and 사자성어 and hanja and idiomatic phrases, everything you need in order to really immerse yourself in a language. Now, I like to think that English is right across the hall from the Korean office, and if I needed to function in English, I would get up from my desk, go across the hall, go into my English office, check out all my resources, and then I'm ready. This really made sense to me because even though there were times where I had to simultaneously translate back and forth, oftentimes I was mentally aware and prepped for that to happen. So let's say that I got a script for a television show where I would be going back and forth explaining things in both Korean or English. My brain was already mentally prepared that that was going to happen, so I felt like I could walk between the offices more comfortably. But if something came up suddenly where I had to make a switch, like there was a time where I was live streaming on Twitch and I had to explain an English comment from one person into Korean for the rest of the chat, and it was almost like my brain screeched to a halt. It was so jarring and startling. I was like, oh no! And this same experience happens to me when I'm reading. If I'm reading in, say, Korean and someone asks me a question in English, it's as if my brain trips and stumbles and falls on its face. Picture open mouth goldfish, just... The reason I like to think of this office imagery is because going back to Russian and Spanish, those offices feel very far away, either in a different building or on a different floor where I have to take the elevator down and I go there and it's all unfamiliar. It's just really uncomfortable. And I guess that just comes down to the fact that I'm not as fluent in those languages. I certainly know that every time I'd be reading in either Spanish or Russian, I felt like I was spending all of my time translating it back into my mother language, rather than just reading it as it is. And it would really slow me down and oftentimes take the enjoyment out of the whole experience, so I oftentimes would just avoid it. But the other thing I wanted to talk with you about is that I ended up enjoying different genres depending on the language. Let me start with Russian. So when I started reading in Russian, I thought, all right, let's pick a book that you know super well, something science fiction or fantasy, something where you know the entire plot, all the characters, all the places, the names of every single thing so you're not gonna get confused. So I'm a child of the 2000s. I ended up reading Harry Potter, and I thought because I knew it so well, I would be able to breeze through this and just start picking up new phrases or vocabulary. But I ended up focusing so much on structure and how certain comedic moments and humor and puns and nuanced jokes were just lost in translation, and even the etymology of words and how they made up different places and character names, it just kind of felt empty and lost, and it really sucked the enjoyment out for me. But I didn't want to give up, so I started checking out poetry. And when I say I love Russian poetry, I mean it is incredible. The depth of imagery and emotion that it can evoke in just one or two sentences, where it would take English about a paragraph or two to reach the same level of a cohesive image. I was blown away by it. If I could recommend to anyone, I really enjoyed the works of Lermontov. I have a book somewhere in my bookshelf, but I just couldn't find it for this video, otherwise I'd show you. I also found myself enjoying Russian literature. I read a lot of Tolstoy and Chekhov and Dostoevsky when I was in AP Literature in high school, but I always found the English to be very dry and stiff and just lacking any sorts of connection. And that's not to say the translation was bad, it just felt like I was observing something from a distance and I was missing some integral link to connect me to the characters in the place. But when I read it in Russian, it opened up a whole new experience for me. I felt like I connected to the character's personality, I could understand their humor so much better, and just having a grasp on the culture and the history and what was going on at that time, it just led to such a better experience overall. So my personal favorite is Master and Margarita by Bulgakov, and when I was living in St. Petersburg, I picked up this tiny little pocket collection of his works, and I absolutely love it. It's probably one of my favorite possessions I brought back. Whew, okay, sorry, ran out of battery. Where was I? Right, Korean. So when it came to Korean, obviously I was a bit more comfortable in the language, so I had a bit more options to choose from, but I thought I'd start again with the same tactic I had with Russian. I picked Harry Potter again. So I got a lot of Harry Potter at the time. Shh, we're not gonna talk about it. But again, I had the same thing happen. I just wasn't enjoying the story. So once again, I turned to poetry. And I mean, I love Korean poetry. But what was interesting is it wasn't necessarily the vocabulary that was drawing me in the way Russian had. I found myself more drawn to the cadence, the rhythm. It was almost lyrical in the way that the poems felt like they were flowing across the page. And given that I knew so much more about the culture and history, I felt such a deeper connection with the poets themselves. I also got into other works of fiction as well. I did read Norwegian Wood in Korean, and I really did enjoy this. I haven't read it in English, so I can't say how that differs in terms of experience, but can recommend for any Korean language learners. Something else I also got into were essays and just kind of thought-provoking books. One of my favorites is called Blow Note. So it's by the leader of a group called Epic High. His name's Tablo, and he hosted a radio show where he would often give a question or just kind of a thought-provoking statement to his listeners at the end of every show, and he put them in a book. And he wrote it in English as well. And finally, the last thing that I got really into was probably the thing I'm going to give the most credit to in terms of my language reading enjoyment would be manhwa. I'm so excited about this. I have been reading Miriko-chan in English, and I'm so excited to read it in Korean now. And it was a really great way for me to absorb the language because I could see what was happening and figure it out through context clues. Now, I will say I also really enjoy reading webtoons, which oftentimes a lot of manhwa are posted on webtoon sites, or you can find various webtoon-only comics to read as well. And I highly recommend people check those out. They're really awesome. And the last thing I really wanted to do was also emphasize some amazing Korean authors. My favorite is Han Kang. Oh my gosh. Highly recommend you check it out, whether it's in English or in Korean. But this has all been just my perspective. Like, am I alone in preferring to read certain types of genres in one language and then a different type of genre in another? Is that just me? Am I alone? Am I weird in being like that? And I'm sure there's probably a ton of polylinguists out there who are like, Kayla, I can read in whatever language and I don't even feel this. I don't know what you're talking about right now. You are incredible. I need to know your secrets. And I want to ask a question to the Goblin Horde here. For any of you who do speak another language comfortably, what is it like for you? Do you have that whole office building sensation of being comfortable but shifting out is hard? Or do you have something different in mind? I'd love to hear about your perspective on that. And for any of our monolinguist speakers out there, I'm just wondering, have you ever read a book that has been translated from one language into another and get that sense of disconnect? Or do you have any books you'd recommend that were translated really well? I'd love to check those out too. And finally, before we go, I want to make sure I give a special thank you to everyone who has been supporting Daniel's Kickstarter for Neon Ghosts, A Witch's Sin. The success of this Kickstarter has blown us away. So there's only one stretch goal left, the 200K mark, and it's rapidly approaching. And there's only roughly about 200 limited editions left. So if you're interested in getting that, make sure you check out the link to the Kickstarter down below and get those before they're gone. And I hope you'll come back soon because I have been working on a secret little side project for Neon Ghosts as well, and I'm really excited to share that with you all in the future. Again, thank you so much to Venti Coffee for sponsoring the video today. We really appreciate you, especially during this time. And finally, thank you all to whoever has stuck to the end of this video. I hope you guys had a good time, and hopefully we'll talk again soon. Okay, bye.